So I think we'll get started. I want to welcome all of you to our evening's talk. My name is Wendy Pearson, and I am the director of the Stockbridge Library, Museum, and Archives. And I am delighted to be participating in this collaboration with Mass Audubon, and very delighted to be introducing Zach Adams, who will be our presenter this evening. And Zach is going to be presenting part 2 of our series on autumn hues and highlights, focusing on autumn in the Berkshires. Last week, we had part 1 focusing on the flora of the area, so all of the changes in the plant life. This evening, we'll focus on the fauna and what we can see in the animal kingdom. If you did not join us for part 1, that is just fine. You'll still enjoy part 2 this evening. And without further ado, Zach, I'm delighted to turn the program over to you.
Thank you so much, Wendy. And thanks, Wendy and the Stockbridge Library for hosting us. And also a big thanks again to the Stockbridge Cultural Council for funding both tonight's program and last week's program as well. Before I open up my slideshow and get all set, I just want to say a couple little things about Mass Audubon. So I'm a teacher naturalist for Mass Audubon. We're a huge nature conservation organization working across the state from Cape Cod all the way out here into the Berkshires. And we do everything from education like you see me doing to science, to citizen science, to land protection, and even advocacy on Beacon Hill. So we do the whole gamut of conservation. And so throughout my talk, I'll talk a little bit towards the end about more bigger conservation concerns and thoughts and how we can all attribute to the future a little bit. So with that, let me jump into it here. If anybody has any questions along the way, feel free to type them in the chat, but I'll definitely answer questions later at the end as well. One second. Just want to get my screen all set up here. There we go. All right. So for tonight, here's the overview. So we have last week's overview, looking at flora, and very similar this week, going to be getting into things like mammals and birds and migration, the idea of phenology and things changing, and a little bit more at the end as well. And always the theme of how to explore and how to capture fall in whatever way you can along the way. So I wanted to start a little bit like last week's talk, just with the overview, but also with this picture from the beginning here. So last week we took a look at this photo, and I forgot to mention, I think all of the photos in here, maybe I missed one or two, but all the photos are ones that I've taken along my journey. So I've got a personal connection to what's going on in these photos. This photo, again, last week I said, well, what do you see in this photo? And we talked a little bit more about the fall foliage colors, the colors of the trees, the plants, what's going on plant-wise. And so this week, with talking about fauna, it's kind of a different question. Rather than not just what you see, but what don't you see in these photos? And that's kind of the idea with fall and animals and autumn and what they're doing in the fall, because it's not what you see necessarily. It's often what you don't see.
Animals.
Exactly, right? So many of the animals, we're not seeing what we're doing. And this is where we left off last week, of kind of this intersection between plants and animals, right? Where we talked about berries, right? And so one of these non-leaf colors of plants is the berries that are produced. And some of these berries or it might be yellow like we see down there. Or maybe if it's bittersweet, we have orange sheaths on the red berries. And once those sheaths fall off, then we have those red berries that come out. Or maybe they're native, maybe they're non-native, but there's so much of this color that is food for animals. And that's where this intersection between plants and animals happens. And it's a super important intersection to understand. And it's often a driver of phenology. And another word, this word I want to, bring up again here. And phenology is, I like to say, it's kind of a map of what's happening in the natural world throughout the year, right? It's kind of your calendar or a calendar of what's happening. And what happens is often that intersection between plants and animals, maybe the animals and their ecosystem, their nesting habitats, their breeding habitats, their food sources. That's the idea of phenology. What is happening and when in the natural world? And that's kind of where we left it off, actually, with this photo and that word. All right. And to restart.
Can I jump in for a half a sec? There is sort of a gray rectangle over your slide, which I thought might have been my machine, but now a couple of other people have piped up in the chat box. And now there's, well.
Here, I will fix that now. How about?
Sorry to interrupt.
No, I appreciate it. Actually, I've got a different function on here, so I can't see the chat. So if anything comes through like that again, could you help me out? Because in this mode of presenting, I can't see the chat. So if anything comes through that people need help seeing, let me know. And can everybody see the photo of the sparrow here?
Well, it's okay. Now there's nothing over it. It's perfect.
Okay. All right. I'll make sure I kind of slow down on my slide transition there. I think it might be a little delay. So with that, jumping right into the topic here of phenology and animals and fall, we're going to start with birds. All right. So if you know me, you know birds are probably my favorite topic to talk about. But let's start with this big idea of migration. So when we think about fall, we think about autumn. I don't just think about the leaves. I think about bird migration. Right. For most of the year, I'm waiting for fall bird migration. It is an amazing time. But migration itself is a really big thing happening. And it's not just happening with birds. I will show you in a little bit some other animals that are going to be migrating as well. But let's talk a little bit about what migration is, and particularly migration with birds. So here's kind of a map of a migration. We're going to use an example here of the yellow warbler. Right. And the yellow warbler, it's a small little yellow bird, beautiful colors. But this is a map of where it spends its life. The pink is where it breeds in the summertime. The yellow is where it's migrating. And that light blue is where it spends its winters. Right. So a general idea of bird migration. General idea for bird migration is that it's birds that are leaving the United States, right? That's kind of one of the big things we think about with migration is birds are leaving one area and going to another, right? It's not necessarily just a short distance. It's often a really big distance. So this is a good example of that. Birds breeding in the northern part of the country and in Canada and going to maybe as far north as Mexico, but South America for a lot of these birds. Right. But why do this, right? Why do we associate, birds with migration, with fall, right? Why are these birds migrating? And a good way to think about it is, I always like to say it's kind of backwards. Rather than our birds going south for the winter, these are birds that came from the tropics just to nest here, right? They're tropical birds that are coming up here for the summertime. Right? Rather than our birds leaving, right? They're only around here for a few months. They spend more time in the tropics than they do up here. And so these are tropical birds that are kind of going back home to the tropics. They're going back to the amazing food sources like berries and plenty of different fruits and insects. But they came back, they come north to breed for a reason, because the competition lessens. All of these birds can spread out all across North America, finding plenty of insects that come out in the summertime, but those insects go away for the winter, right? In the wintertime in the tropics, there's no snow. It's generally an easier winter, plenty of food, right? But to reduce some of that competition, they head back north in the spring. You can also, like I said, that word phonology, we can time out bird migration. We can time it down. I like to say bird migration is not just one thing. It's 300 little things happening, right? Every species has its own migratory pattern. Every individual often has its own pattern. And so we can map that out through the year. This is, again, a map of our yellow warbler throughout the year and when it's seen in Berkshire County. And if you look there, it's kind of a drastic start date. When they arrive, maybe just a little trickle towards the end of April. May 1st is just about the date for yellow warbler, right? You can see as soon as May 1st comes around, then all of a sudden we have loads of yellow warblers when just a few days before there was essentially none, right? And then these birds, rather than having that same sharp cutoff time in the fall, as soon as they finish up breeding, they start to trickle away. And by September, they're gone. So if you're thinking about bird identification, it kind of helps. You know, you're not going to see a yellow warbler in January. You might see a warbler that's yellow, but not a yellow warbler, right? Their migration really takes them pretty far, and they are gone come September and definitely October. All right. There's another when to this though too, and these birds are migrating at night. So one of my this is probably my favorite part of bird study is nocturnal migration of these birds. So most of our songbirds, a lot of our migratory birds in general, are migrating at night. The winds are generally less. They can use stars and planets for navigation. They can use mountain ranges. They can use other features for navigation. And there's less predators, avian predators at night. Our owls tend to stay pretty low towards the ground and in the forest, so they can avoid a lot of those sky predators like falcons and hawks. So these birds are moving at night. These incredible journeys. Some birds are going all the way from Alaska to Brazil. Right. So for some of these birds, they're flying from maybe Massachusetts to Brazil nonstop, 80 hours of a journey nonstop. So these migrations are really incredible. And it's at night for most of them. Even things like ducks and geese are moving at night. And a really cool thing you can always try is looking for these birds at night. If you look at the moon through binoculars, sometimes you can see birds flying across your view of the moon. Believe it or not, it's true. People do it, and you can capture some of those birds migrating at night by looking at the moon. And on top of that, they're making sounds along the way. So this is where I really get nerdy, and you can hear the sounds of these birds as they're migrating. Sometimes it's just subtle little zip, chip, zip, right? And it's really tough to hear. And then sometimes when certain birds are migrating, maybe they sing their whole song, like cuckoos that go as they fly over at night, or thrushes that make pretty loud sounds like whip and wow. Even at night, you can't see these birds, but you can hear these sounds around you. It's a really amazing phenomenon to experience. So a great way to experience fall by listening to those nocturnal flight calls. And shortly, we're going to start to hear more things like ducks and geese migrating at night, and they're plenty loud to hear. But we can also map migration out with who's migrating, right? So most of our songbirds are migrating. 70% of our songbirds are migrating. Means that some are staying around too, but we also have waterfowl and raptors and other water birds that are migrating. I've got a couple of samples here of maybe some colors you can catch in the fall that are bird related. So if we think about songbirds, just like I showed you that map earlier, right? This is what a general long distance songbird migration looks like. We call this a neotropical migrant. They're going to the new tropics. So this is an example. This map here is from a Swainson's thrush. This Swainson's thrush breeds, believe it or not, at the top of Mount Greylock. And I'm not sure at any other place in Massachusetts even. So this bird breeds top of Mount Greylock, and it'll go all the way to Central and South America for the winter. And you can see this bird does not end up in the US at all for the winter. They are long gone by the winter time. So, and that's a good example right there. But lots of other things other than thrushes are migrating. We have sparrows, we have flycatchers, vireos, warblers. Some warblers are taking short migrations, some are taking long migrations. You can see the S and the L that I have written there behind the types of birds. Short, or S means short and L means long. So these are two different migration patterns. If it's a short migration, maybe they're going to the southern part of the country, but a long distance migration means they're leaving the country. All right. Here's a couple of good ideas of waterfowl. So when we think about waterfowl migration, it might look different depending on where you are in the world. But one thing that waterfowl have in common is they like to stay together in big groups. They're extremely social. So you'll see groups of waterfowl and not just one species, often mixed groups of species all together. And usually not just one duck or one goose, but lots of ducks and geese. This is kind of an extreme example here. This is where I grew up in Pennsylvania. These are snow geese. And in this location in Pennsylvania, and it's a very narrow migration that snow geese take. They have a very narrow path of migration, so narrow that we generally don't get snow geese visiting us in the Berkshires almost at all. Maybe a few groups that come through every year, but very low numbers. The opposite happens where I grew up, and at this location, they sometimes get over 100,000 snow geese all at once on one lake, just like we're seeing here. And there's not just snow geese out there, but there's tundra swans and plenty of different species of ducks and Canada geese. And so you see, this is waterfowl migration is really noticeable because you often see them all together and they're attracted to water. Again, that's what the snow goose groups look like. And this is a few thousand birds, maybe about 5,000 birds here. So if you can imagine 100,000, I certainly can't, but it's a big number. But it gives us an opportunity to see some amazing waterfowl, like this duck here called the canvasback, which breeds up in the Arctic, in the tundra, coming down here and even farther south in the winter, not quite to South America, but really a lot of them end up in the Chesapeake Bay, a really beautiful bird named because that the canvas-like color of the back there. Here's a really wild looking duck called the Harlequin Duck. Incredible colors, right, with that beautiful rusty sides and the white stripes and the facial markings there. It's a really cool bird. And this is a bird that actually goes to the Massachusetts coastline and picks some of the roughest conditions to spend the winter on those rock jetties that go out into the bays and into the ocean that are battered with the waves and the tides. And that's where they like to be. They're coming from harsh river conditions, just the same in the central part of the country and farther north. But we also have a lot of raptors that migrate, hawks and owls and ospreys and eagles, these birds of prey that are migrating as well. And this is a good example here of, that first, the initial idea I brought tonight of the migration that, things that are happening that you don't see happening or that you might not hear. This little owl here, actually, that's my hand even. Right. So this was a place that I worked at a different part of my life. And this little owl is the saw-whet owl, the northern saw-whet owl. It's the smallest owl we have in the East. It only weighs about 1/4 pound, and they're migratory. Most of them breed in Canada, and they're coming out of Canada and say Maine and New Hampshire and those northern states with lots of spruce fir, the boreal type ecosystems, and they're spending their winters here in Massachusetts and farther south. Some go as far south as Virginia. And it's not just a few of them, it's a lot of these birds that are migrating. But they're hard to find in migration. In fact, they're migrating right now, but it's silent. Right? Owls fly silently. We hardly know where these birds are. And they can show up in a huge variety of places, from deep, dark conifer forests to maybe some shrub lines on the edge of a trail in a city, right? Maybe in Central Park even. And this quiet little migration is happening, but we don't see it, but it's still happening there. And I think that's so much fun to, to think about the things that we're not noticing. Sometimes you can hear them though. They have a nice little toot sound rather than a hoot like a lot of owls make. They make more like a toot. They're named after the sound of sharpening a saw blade with a whetstone. Just a little toot like that. But they're not the only bird of prey that migrates. This bird here is the broad-winged hawk, and broad-winged hawks are long-distance migrants. In fact, they're going all the way to South America, and they pretty much do not winter in North America at all. The earliest reports of broad-winged hawks in our area would probably be maybe the end of March. There's one sighting in Berkshire County. One time a bird came back early that people noticed. So they have a really specific migration. In fact, in the fall, you can track broad-winged hawk migration down to maybe 2 weeks, right? Say maybe from about the 10th of September to the 25th of September. Those 2 weeks are when broad-winged hawks migrate. In fact, they're gone now. We don't see broad-winged hawks anymore in October. So this is a thing that's happening, again, that maybe we don't see or hear because broad-winged hawks fly really high, floating on the hot air thermals, and you need binoculars or spotting scopes to see them a lot of times. So it's another thing that's happening, but we might not notice. Lots of other birds related to water are migrating in the fall too. And if we think about it, their fall migration is really related to what water availability there is. Is there ice in places? Can they find food? This little bird on the right, we call, it's a type of shorebird, a type of sandpiper, and it uses that beak to find food in soil, in sand. And so the ground has to be soft enough for it to find food. So these birds don't like to be in the Berkshires in the winter when the ground is frozen, but you can sometimes find them on the coast. This bird here is called a dunlin, and they're often found on the coast in the wintertime with the soil that's not quite frozen. But lots of other birds in this category, like the dunlin, that are often social like this and can be found in big groups, or are seabirds like northern gannets that can be found up and down the coast in the wintertime. And I talked a little bit about where they migrate, but here's, rather than where do they go to, think about what paths they take on migration. And one way to think about that is flyways. So on the image on the right, we can see 4 different flyways. These are kind of like our time zones here. Right? We have our Central, we have our Mississippi, we have our Pacific, and we have our Atlantics. We have 4 different flyways here. And these are general paths that populations of birds take. You can actually narrow down, a population of birds that uses one of these flyways. Those snow geese that I showed you earlier, often snow geese pick one of these flyways for their whole life often. And so we even talk about those birds and their population based upon what flyways they use. But what's really interesting about the flyways is if you look at the topographic map on the left, can you just about see where those flyways are, but use the things like mountains and the elevation to kind of guess where those flyways are? You can almost see those elevation changes and kind of funneling birds through there. So in the east, we have the Appalachian Mountains that funnels birds down along the coast, right? The Mississippi River Valley brings birds down through the river valley to the Gulf, right? The Great Plains is a whole flyway through there, right? And mountains in between there. We can see those mountain ridges, and the Rockies split off the plains from the Pacific flyway. So you can even see geographically where these birds are going. Land features have a huge important purpose in how birds migrate and how they navigate on their long journeys. And here's a couple of fun bird colors I wanted to share here along the way. Here are some fun things to look out for. Like I said, I like to share how do you get the most of it. So here are a couple of good examples of things to look for along the way. Plenty of warblers are migrating. And now that it's October, a lot of our warblers are gone, but we still have a couple left. This one here is the palm warbler. Palm warblers are pretty cooperative. In fact, you can get pretty close to palm warblers a lot of the time. They tend to be pretty showy. They're very yellow, pretty streaky on the chest, kind of rufusy brown colors on the face and on the cap. This is a little insect-eating bird. They could hang around as late as November sometimes. So they're pretty hardy warblers, but they'll be on their way shortly. So this is a good one to look out for. Again, that's the palm warbler. This warbler here, another hardier warbler. This warbler spends a lot of time with us. It's one of the earlier warblers to show up in the spring, maybe just before May 1st. They'll hang out. They're probably just about all gone from the area, but so we have plenty of time with them. This is called the black-throated green warbler. You can see they love to feed in the apple trees in the fall, but they'll be breeding in hemlock trees, in mixed forests in the summertime. We have loads of black-throated green warblers here in the summertime, but again, just slowly leaving around here. And beautiful colors. They really have a golden face, and their back really is kind of a limey green color. You can see just a little bit of that black on the throat. And like all of our warblers, they tend to change colors a good bit in the fall. And so we have this kind of a drabber version of what they might look like in the springtime. And red-winged blackbirds will still be around here for a little bit. I know in the springtime, people think about red-winged blackbirds as maybe a sign of spring when they come back to start nesting in the marshes, but we can still see them now in the fall. And I chose this photo here because, you know, I always challenge people to take a close look at birds, right? And maybe you just see a bird that you see, maybe it's just black or brown and streaky. But this young male red-winged blackbird here, if you look closely on the wing, right, this is not just a little speckled bird. It's got a white stripe on the wing, and that eventually the top of the wing there is going to be red, the red-winged blackbird, right? But you can see the red's not in yet on this bird. It didn't grow those red feathers. Instead, there's these orangey yellow feathers poking out there, right? It doesn't have all of those red feathers yet. It's in between. And so you can get this amazing detail on these birds, right? But you just have to take a closer look. So these are some of the fall colors I think of with birds. And a big one here, again, the little brown birds and sparrows. I love sparrows. In fact, I just did a whole program last weekend on sparrows. We spent 2 hours just studying sparrows at one of our sanctuaries. But this is where so much amazing color is. Sparrows are not just little brown birds. They have so much detail and so much color. If you look at a sparrow's face, you're not going to see just brown. You're going to see whites and grays and blacks and yellows and golds and sometimes pinks and reds. They have so much color. So you just have to take that closer look. Take the time here. This Savannah sparrow might even winter with us, but most of them head south for the winter. Some of them go pretty far and some of them don't go too far. Like I said, some will even hang out. In fact, last night we did a nice little night walk at one of our Mass Audubon sanctuaries, and we walked through a field and we were watching Savannah sparrows at night fly away from us in the field under this full moon. Another sparrow to give you here, and this is a sparrow that'll hang around with us for the winter. This is our white-throated sparrow. These are the birds that like to hang out under your feeder, picking up the seed that all the other birds drop. They love to hang out in the shrubs, and maybe you'll start to hear them as they show up a little bit more. They like to sing in the fall and in the spring. They have a beautiful song that's whistled, "Oh, sweet Canada, Canada, Canada." So listen for that. Again, good things to listen for and to look for in the fall. But who else is migrating? And the reality is a lot of things are migrating other than birds, right? Amphibians, we think of migrating in the spring, but they're also doing a little bit of migration and movements in the fall. Maybe this isn't a big movement like in the spring where they move to vernal pools, but this is probably migrating to where they're going to spend the winter, farther into the forest. Things like this wood frog here bury down into the leaf litter and they actually freeze for the whole winter long. So they're eating a little bit and getting ready to freeze shortly, right? But a lot of other animals are doing different things. Butterflies actually can be migratory. And this is kind of a multi-parted migration for some butterflies, where they're flying big distances, they're laying eggs and breeding, and the young hatch, and then that next generation goes the next distance. They say for monarchs, the big migrator, they're going to Mexico, and that might be 3 generations of a journey, 3 cycles of young and adults coming through there till the monarchs get to Mexico. And that's where a lot of them winter. But it's not just monarchs. We have loads of butterflies that we say this is a flight time, right? Where they're starting to migrate and move. And things like this one here, this is kind of a less common butterfly called a gray hair streak. And there's all these hair streaks that are picking the fall to fly and look for what flowers are left over. And the little hair streaks, this is a big one, is almost about the size of a quarter. So big for a hair streak. Some of them can be about the size of your thumbnail, even that they're so small. Bats can also be migratory, but bats, and this is the one photo that I didn't take here, but bats can have a couple different strategies. We do have some bats that are hibernators. We have cave hibernators, like little brown bats. And we have tree bark hibernators, like big brown bats that spend their time in the bark of tree, or long-eared bats will do the same thing. In the bark of heavily barked trees like shagbark hickories. Big brown bats are more likely to spend the winter in your attic too. But a good bunch of these bats are migratory as well, going a little farther south, maybe spending a little bit of hibernation farther south, or finding places where there's insects that can sustain them for the winter. And I chose this photo here of a specific bat because there's so many bats that are migrating through that, and we don't really see them because they're coming out at night, and we don't get to see how amazing they are. This is actually called a hoary bat. It's called hoary because that nice white frosting coating all over it, kind of like hoarfrost that you see on kind of the vaporized, the vapor particles of water on animals in the winter time where it freezes. But the hoary bat is a bigger bat. It's about the size of a big brown bat, even bigger. And it's beautiful. It's got that silvery white tips, the frosty tips to its hair. It's a beautiful little bat, but we really don't see them. And so that's why I picked this one there. And another thing that's happening in fall and in the forests, in the fields that we don't see. And then there's micro migrations. So even white-tailed deer do a little bit of migration. They do this micro migration. The idea that maybe they're just shifting short distances on the landscape, changing resources for the winter, following food, right? Maybe they're making elevational changes. Our white-throated sparrow, like I talked about, is coming out of the mountains to lower elevation. In fact, we have white-throated sparrows that breed near us, but they're coming off of the mountains like Mount Greylock to be down here for the winter. White-tailed deer will do the same thing. They'll come off of the higher ridge lines to come to warmer climates a little farther downhill, right? And maybe it's just minor ecosystem changes like thermal refuges. Deer will often move maybe to conifer stands on really cold days or really cold parts of the winter, where the conifers, the pines, and the spruces help to insulate some of the heat underneath them, keep them just a little bit warmer. So we have a micro migration happening as well, just that little bit to find the best way to survive the winter. And then, if they're not migrating, what is everything doing? What are these animals doing? Some of them are preparing for hibernation. They're getting ready to hibernate. Some of them are preparing to stick it out for the winter. And some of them are changing their life cycles, actually. So let's start with that one. Some animals, like insects, start to go through life cycle changes, through metamorphosis in the fall. Our aquatic insects kind of give their last efforts of hatching from the water. This here is a caddisfly. And the caddisfly lays its eggs in the water, right? And then the young live in the water. So after they're an egg, they turn into a larva, and then they're in the water as a larva for maybe a year or maybe a couple years, depending on the species, right? But they're changing from that larva to a pupa, and that pupa to the adult flying insect that's out of the water in the fall. And these nice warm days like we've had here are huge hatches of insects. Here's a couple more examples. On the right is a mayfly, and the left is the caddisfly casing. That's where the caddisflies are going to live in the winter. But on the right, this mayfly, there's hundreds of species of mayfly. I think over 200 species of mayflies, and they're changing from just this stage. This is the nymph stage of a mayfly into the adults. So again, these nice warm days, there's likely thousands or millions of these insects hatching and flying around our rivers. The Housatonic River is a great place to see huge hatches of mayflies and stoneflies and caddisflies in the fall like this, especially with the last couple of warm days hanging on. And it becomes a super important food for fish, right? The fish are taking advantage of this time for the insects, and they're eating a lot of these insects that are starting to metamorphose, right? So all this insect activity is leading to fish activity, and fish don't hibernate. They just slow down in the winter. They're still feeding, but they're doing a big feed in the fall right before they really start to slow down. Often some of the fish are even spawning in the fall and getting on beautiful colors like this brook trout here. So even in our little quiet, tiny mountain streams, the brook trout are doing this whole thing too. Here's a little closer view of what these life cycles look like. This is the mayfly that can live for maybe 2 or 3 years as a nymph under the water. So even in the winter, they're moving around. Some mayflies go dormant under the water, but often a lot of them are eating, and they are vegetarians. They're eating little microscopic particles on the rocks and in the water. But what they do is they hatch from the nymph to an adult that's called a dun, and they're not quite ready to breed yet. What they do is they fly to something, shed the exoskeleton, then they breed, they lay eggs, and then their life cycle is finished. So they have a pretty short lifespan once they're an adult, but they can live for a few years in the water. A stonefly is a little simpler than that. They just climb out of the water, hatch, breed, and lay eggs. But since we're talking about water, let's get into all those other things that I talked about that are happening other than just changing life cycles, right? Those animals that are preparing for winter in different ways. And I like to talk about beavers here. Beavers, there's a big misconception about beavers that they hibernate in winter, that they go into their lodges and they go to sleep for the winter, but they don't. So fall is a super, super important time for beavers. This is when they're probably the most active they're going to be during the year. They're finishing up their lodges. They might be building new lodges. If they're young of the year, they might be finishing up dams, fixing a few leaks, and cutting down as much wood as they can to store for the winter, as much tree branches. They're not eating the wood, they're eating the bark from the woods. They need to store branches underwater for the winter, right? Isn't that amazing to think about? Beavers are so complicated and so intelligent. I could go on, and I have for hours about beavers, but the idea is they're not hibernating. They're going to be active for the winter. So they're preparing for their activity in the winter, right? What we see here is actually the edge of a beaver dam. It's hard to tell in this photo because of all of the shrubs and grasses. Those shrubs and grasses are there because the beavers have cut down the bigger trees, allowing shorter things to grow, get enough sunlight. And then the beavers harvest those smaller branches about the size of your finger to store in the water. The water becomes their refrigerator for the winter, right? And they're able to access that food store. We call it a cache in the winter. So some of what you see here is going to become beaver food. They kind of plan ahead in that way. Here's the other side of that dam. And we can see this is what a beaver pond looks like. We have the dam here on our right. We have the lily pads that are here because the beavers have raised the water level and slowed the water down. And we even have the lodge here, right? So somewhere in this pond is going to be a cache. They're going to swim under the ice in the water all winter long to get their food. And here is an example of a beaver lodge in the winter, right? You can see it poking out there. There's even a few airways to get some air into that lodge in the winter. Some people say they claim they can even see a little warm air coming up out of the beaver lodges. I've never seen it, but they stay warm in there. That's how they survive the winter, even going down into the water. Really incredible. But this is important here. Why, building this lodge here in the winter, this is important not just because that's how they survive the winter, but because it helps them complete their life cycle. It helps them rear young. In a way, they do this whole pond building and lodge building because they give birth in the winter, maybe in February or March, to young inside of the lodge. Deep down in there in that nice cozy lodge, I always say beavers are probably in there with a cup of coffee and a newspaper, but that's where they're giving birth. And these lodges are impenetrable. Bears can't even get into them, right? So they're protected all winter long. Otters can't break through the ice, so the otters can't even get in there and get to the young. So this is a great safe place for them to rear their young in the winter and to help to nurse them before they're able to eat bark like the adults do. Now, a similar animal here that, unlike the beavers, they do a little bit of hibernating. But for bears, hibernation is not a set in stone thing. It is not one thing, just like migration's not. Hibernation doesn't mean that bears are going to sleep at a certain time and sleeping for the whole winter. It's likely that a lot of bears wake up at certain points in the winter. And if it's a warm winter, bears will wake up earlier, right? If they can find food, they will do it, right? The warmer the winter, the easier it is on them. And so our warmer winters with climate change are going to expect bears to be out a little bit longer in the year. I often, almost every winter for the last 5 winters, I've seen bear tracks in the snow, right? In this neck of the woods. So they are moving around in the snow in January and February sometimes, if it's warm enough. But if we have some really super cold weeks and months, it's likely a lot of bears are going to be asleep. And they're going to be denned up, and maybe in different types of dens, under trees, next to rocks, kind of those deep holes, maybe not necessarily a dugout lodge, but it depends on the bear situation. But just like the beavers, right, the bears are denning up for a reason, right? So often if you see a bear in the winter, it's likely a male, right? Because they're moving around, they want food, they're getting into trouble. But the females are denning up for a reason, because that's when they give birth as well. If you think about it, just like the beavers, they're finding a safe place when a lot of other animals are finding other sources of food where they can be safe in a den, often covered in snow. And often, even when they give birth, the mothers aren't fully waking up from hibernation. Even when they're nursing their young, they're not fully wide awake. Even they're still really in a little bit of a state of torpor where they're able to save a lot of energy. And so bears are a big one we think of fall too. At this time of year, they're probably getting close to maybe looking for food, maybe close to 20 hours a day for some bears. Rather than just being nocturnal, and they are most of the year, they're now spending a ton of time looking for food. So now is when your feeders are at risk still, because they're really looking to bulk up for the winter, eating the last of the berries and whatever food they can find. And a couple little things here I wanted to share, and that was a couple of nice videos of bears at some of our sanctuaries here, using our sanctuaries in different ways. And I know it's often tough with videos and internet connections. I did set it up so the video should be optimized. So if it doesn't go through, I apologize for that, everybody. But I'll play it 2 times to try to get the most of it. If the video's coming through all right, you can see the bear walks right along the boardwalk there, taking the easy path. Just searching for food a little bit, not in too much of a rush. Play it one more time here. And the cool thing about this video too is you can see there's a tree here on the left that the beavers have been cutting down. This is all happening in the same place. What a remarkable thing going on. Here's another video here of a bear. Again, these are videos that we've taken at our sanctuary. And notice some of them are during the day. Both of these videos are during daylight, even though this one looks a little gray, like it's using infrared. They're during the daylight hours. So bears aren't always just nocturnal, right? They're moving around looking for food whenever they can. And a bear this size all by itself is probably a young male looking for food. Probably just left its mother. Bears will stay with the mother for 1 to 2 years. Here's kind of a funny one. This is it's kind of quick. You can see, oh, there we go. You can see this bear is playing with the camera a little bit at the end. I always like to say that it's really interesting when I see videos a lot on. So this is a trail camera. So we put this camera out there in the woods. It has a motion sensor. We can capture videos and photos of animals when we're not on the sanctuaries. But it's always interesting because bears seem to go right up to cameras a lot and they smell around. And what it probably is they're smelling us. They're smelling us on the cameras, right? Bears have an incredible sense of smell, close to 1 million times more scent receptors in their nose than we have. And so our scents that are left over from oils on our hands, or maybe we ate what we ate for lunch, are probably going to make the bears curious there. I'll play that one more time here. Seems like the bear goes away, but still plays with the camera a good bit. So again, I want to bring up this slide. So if you saw this last week, I talked about this same thing, but kind of a few, closing down the talk tonight, a few take home important thoughts here. And again, I used this slide last week, but it's a really important one. And this idea of, it's called trophic mismatch. And the idea that, phenology is happening. These plants, these animals, these insects, they're all interacting at different stages and at very specific times often. And what's food for one animal might be an important part of another's animal life cycle. And one animal might be food for another animal. And it all kind of lines up phenologically. But if one thing starts to get out of place, we could have this mismatch of timings, right? Trophic means the energy flow through natural living beings. And so, if there's an energy flow that's missing, maybe flowers are blooming at a different time than they did. Maybe the warmer temperatures are causing things, animals to act in different ways, insects to hatch, and just like the aquatic insects changing their life cycle stages at different times. Maybe those warmer temperatures we're getting with climate change is just pushing one or two of these little factors Maybe, like I said, flowers or insects. And the predators or the grazers of those situations, right? They're going to be impacted by that timing. The bird here on the right needs insects to eat on its migration. And one insect that it eats is flying ants. And often that might not line up their migration when flying ants are hatching. And so it's super important to see what's going to happen with warmer years, right? Warmer temperatures and changing of producers and changing of primary consumers, and how that's going to all line up. That, where are things going to mismatch, and what's going to be the impact here? So for our birds, we can see that we are having impacts due to climate change. And this is a really famous graphic from a really famous study from Cornell that was just published a few years ago, showing that in the last 50 years, we've lost something like 3 billion birds, right? And so it's huge declines of birds. And these birds that we're seeing here, almost all of them are invertebrate eaters, insect eaters for a lot of these birds. And so the idea that maybe our insect populations might not be doing as well, or not acting when they're at the same periods, might impact their migration or their ability to feed young. So what I want to leave you with a couple of ideas of what you can do at home. And that's things like planting native plants. Our native plants are not just good for the just because they're native plants, but they attract native insects and they attract birds to those insects. And those native insects help other native plants pollinate, right? The idea that we're helping to bring pollinators and keeping pollinator populations healthy, right? We can engage in citizen science like eBird, which I'll talk about shortly, right? We can reduce pesticide uses and on a large scale, but also around our homes. Preventing window collisions for birds, putting up detractors like stickers, or different materials to help prevent birds from flying into windows, keeping your cats indoors, and voting for nature, voting for legislation and candidates that support climate change work. So with that, I'll leave you with a nice citizen science opportunity here, and that's eBird. This is the world's largest natural history-based citizen science project. There are something like 600,000 people all across the globe engaged with eBird, and that number is always growing. And this database here that eBird has something like 60 or 70 million lists of birds that have been seen. And so in a way, all of us together, all the people that care about birds, even if you just know the chickadee or the cardinal in your yard, that's valuable data to understand where birds are, because there's a lot more people that aren't scientists that are scientists. And so that's a way that everybody can get involved in bird knowledge, or in contributing to bird science. So if you want to check that out, eBird's a really, really incredible citizen science project. Can get you into birding as well. But here's a really cool use of it. All right. This is a map of birds and migration. So where there's a darker pink color, right, that's more birds, lighter blue is less birds, and no color is no birds, right? But through science, we're able to track bird migration, right? And this here is actually radar stations that have birds are migrating at such high densities that radar stations can pick up bird migration. And this can help us know when to go out and look for birds, right? And it can help kind of our sightings can help ground truth where birds are migrating, right? Maybe this might show bird migration, but what are people seeing? What is that? What are they experiencing? And so it's a cool way how science and citizen science is paired together there. So with that, everybody, I will take questions. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
I don't have a question, but Zach, I do want to just thank you. That was so informative, and your photographs are just amazing. You really have a lot of talents as
Thank you.
a
I have a
scientist.
question.
And
Go ahead.
Yeah, my question, I put it in the chat, but
Oh,
I have woodchucks, doesn't everybody, under my deck, under my shed. And are they true hibernators? One of them I started calling Fatso because he was eating so much and fattening up, and I haven't seen him in a couple of weeks. But normally they fatten all up and then they disappear for the winter, and then they emerge in the spring, unfortunately, sometimes with babies. But are they true hibernators?
yep, they're hibernators. Yep, they're staying down there, they're sleeping, and they're giving birth in the winter, or they'll give birth in the summertime.
Oh, they're not, they're going in the winter? Okay.
You know, I might be wrong about that. They're more of a they're more of a summer breeder. Sorry.
I think they're giving birth later in the spring. That's when I
Yeah,
started seeing the babies later.
yeah. More gestation is taking place in the winter there. You know, so the important period of time to kind of go dormant for a little.
I've been very lucky though, in that they seem to have babies, but then some of them disappear. So I end up by fall with no more than I started with, thank heaven. Tried to catch them, but unfortunately I caught a raccoon, squirrels, and then a skunk, and then I gave up.
They're funny creatures. They're funny to watch. I see a question here. Someone says, were the snow geese at Middle Creek? Yep, that was almost my backyard growing up, just a few minutes from my house. So that was from Middle Creek. Squirrels, chipmunks, and bobcats. Good question. All right. Squirrels are active all winter and bobcats are active all winter, but chipmunks tend to do a bit of hibernating. But I've seen them almost every month of the winter as well. Those warm days, they'll come out and eat a little bit. And just like with bears, you know, it's not necessarily a full sleeping hibernation. You know, they're going to wake up from time again, maybe, you know, shake some of the dust off and then go back to sleep. Right. It's they don't have to, you know, be asleep for that whole period of time. In fact, a lot of animals do a hibernation that's kind of like that, where they wake up periodically throughout the winter. Maybe they don't go anywhere, but they're waking up a little bit. One kind of like opposite of that is our cave dwelling bats tend to be super hibernators. They are not supposed to wake up in the winter. They're like out. But that's you know, a conservation concern there, and how bats in caves have picked up a fungus called white nose syndrome, and nobody knows exactly where the fungus came from. We know where it's first found in New York State, but it wakes bats up in the winter, and that energy draw really is a big suck on them, and they're not able to get those stores of energy back because they'll fly around looking for food, and that food's not necessarily there. So they often don't have enough energy to kind of thermoregulate for the rest of the winter. How do squirrels survive the cold winter? Storing food. So I didn't really get into too much about, you know, winter, what they do in the winter, but birds and mammals like squirrels are going to store food for the winter. Squirrels probably are not quite as good at remembering where it is. Birds are fantastic at remembering where they store their food. In fact, chickadees are remarkable, but squirrels tend to forget, and that's why we have trees. Because the seeds that they forget, those acorns or those walnuts, right, those turn into trees. So it's kind of part of that natural process there that they forget a little bit. Any other questions?
I think you
Question about chipmunk.
everything.
All right.
My chipmunks are constantly coming in and out of little holes in the grass. So I assume that they spend the winter in those same holes, which of course have been built before the ground has all frozen. And then they sort of dig out through the snow to come out, because you said they emerge. Sometimes.
Yeah, you know, it depends on, it could be holes in the ground. Often where I see chipmunks coming out of in the winter is like holes in rocks. right? Or tree. So I don't know necessarily if they're going to use those holes in the winter. Like I mean, I'll often see in the winter you can find chipmunk tracks sometimes, or I've seen them and they're coming right out of that, like, knotty tree stump where and they're probably buried somewhere deep down in there.
Okay, they change their digs in the winter.
Probably. The other thing that's really wild in the winter is it's likely that there's not much frozen earth in the forest in the winter. The leaf litter and the structure of the forest, it means probably a lot of forest soil isn't frozen. It doesn't have, like out in our, like in a yard, we might have 38 inches of frost. In the forest, it might not necessarily be the same. So it might be a little easier, just a little bit underground.
Well,
Thank you.
Zach,
This has been great.
you were amazing. Thank you so much. It's great to have you, and thank you all for joining us this evening. And again, you can see a recording of this evening's presentation if you would like to.